Thanks a lot, Wendy. Can you guys hear me okay? I have a little lapel thing on.
Can you turn it up or do you turn it up?
It's good? Okay. I don't want to blow anybody's ears out. So I'm Alistair Erskine. I'm awfully grateful for your invitation to come to talk about a topic which is, I think, really interesting in terms of the direction it's going. I've had a terrific time over the past 24 hours talking to a whole series of different people about the amazing organization that you guys have. What I'm going to talk about today is basically talk about what we've done in our journey with informatics and with our process reengineering, and then talk about the problem we ran into when we were trying to externalize this to other people, and then sort of a solution that we came up with that seemed to work okay. So for those that don't know, Geisinger is a health system that is located in central Pennsylvania and is now expanding to other markets like West Virginia and Maine and New Jersey and so forth. And the other piece about Geisinger, which is interesting, is like you, we have a health plan. And our health plan helps us understand those things that are more population health or care management or actuarial related in terms of how we take care of the whole continuum of patients as opposed to more the care delivery side. So really the two work side by side together. We have a number of own physicians, about 1,200, and then we have a number of affiliate physicians and unowned physicians as well. Community hospitals, big hospital, urban areas, very rural areas with a lot of outreach needed in using telehealth systems. So I learned that this was a Learning Health System series talk, so I thought it would be a good idea to actually put a definition up there. This happens to be the Institute of Medicine definition, which is changing its name, but progress in science, informatics, and care culture that aligns and creates new knowledge. So a process which creates new knowledge as an ongoing natural byproduct of the care process. So something that is not necessarily premeditated, but something that is arrived at just from taking care of patients. That seamlessly refines and delivers best practice, and the goal is just continuous improvement. So we contributed to some of the literature, and I say we as the royal we. It was really many of the people that arrived at Geisinger before I did. And the great thing about the Learning Health System is all these, as you probably know, are available for free PDF download off of the Institute of Medicine website for anybody to read and learn from. So we certainly went through that exercise. And what we did with that is we wanted to hardwire how we do innovation at Geisinger by setting up various different institutes and centers to be able to accomplish that. Now the first is called the Institute for Advanced Applications. And the idea behind the word application, my colleague Greg Moore that leads this institute would say it's because we like to do things, we like to apply, we don't want to just think about them. And this institute really has three different centers. One's the Center for Clinical Innovation, and this is where we come up with new workflows that identify patients' care gaps, new ways that we do documentations, new clinical applications. This group takes data that may be in Epic and creates new dimensional database models that reorganize the data in a way that's more intuitive. We also have the Center for Healthcare System Reengineering, and this is a number of engineers that are looking at workflows through the hospital using things like real-time location services to identify where a patient or a provider or a piece of equipment may be located at any one time and understanding where there are bottlenecks. And also the Center for Emerging Technology and Informatics, which is all the gadgets and gizmos and new things that are coming, what value do they have in the healthcare environment, Internet of Things, and so forth. So that's step one. It's sort of the cone is pretty wide in terms of how we acquire things that are innovative and let people think about ways to do things differently at Geisinger. Next is a group that I lead called Applied Research and Clinical Informatics. So we call it DARCY and the division of. And that's step two. And step two really is a lot of what the typical CMIO would do, which is EHR optimization and apps. So this is where we come up with ways to figure out what is the risk that a patient's going to have a 72-hour readmission, and then organizing the patient list in order to be able to prioritize against those patients, and then to push more interventions in terms of home health and care management support. The Open Notes initiative, so this is an initiative that we started with two other organizations where every patient's note is immediately shared with a patient portal. the note about the discharge, the note about the clinic note, the note about their admission. And the idea being that by doing that, we're being more transparent about what doctors and other people are writing about the patient, and then helping the patient then ask questions where there's a health literacy issue around what's going on. And there's a lot of gastric juices flowing when we first started this particular program. And we studied it carefully before and after and found that the various different things we were worried about, both on the patient and provider side, end up not manifesting themselves in reality. The patients love it. 99% of those who got enrolled in notes stayed with open notes. And the providers were worried that patients were going to send their notes to their lawyers, and instead they were sending their notes to their family to better understand. So the coordination of care ended up being better. So this group of, in terms of EMR optimization and identifying care gaps, so every day we run about 550,000 times 172 care gaps per patient in our system. And where we identify still open care gaps, put that into the clinical workflow, again, back in Epic, to be able to put it in front of anyone on the healthcare team that can address a particular care gap. And then we have ways to be able to redistribute that work to others. The other part that Darcy, again, this clinical informatics group is involved in is all of our data warehousing activity, all of our relational databases, which means taking Epic data and taking health plan data and costing data and press gaining information and pushing it into a relational system, as well as doing on the non-relational side. So doing the things that Netflix, Amazon, and everybody else have been doing for a while now in terms of using Hadoop and various big data type of tools to take the kind of data that doesn't fit properly into a column and a row and be able to store it and then use programming languages like Java and other things to be able to then extract more meaning out of that and then create data sets that could sit into a relational system. So it's really a big data engine. It's how we address some of the genomics work that we're sequencing 250,000 patients' whole exome sequences at Geisinger from patients that have consented for the blood work. And so processing that information and returning those results back to the patients is another piece. And then our work with I2B2 and MedCap, like a lot of academic organizations that collaborate and look at research data that way. And then the other thing that we're doing in Darcy is those kinds of patient-facing things and things that untether us from desktop computers and untether us from brick-and-mortar buildings. So it's telehealth services, it's giving iPads to patients right before they have an elective surgery, and having them meet their healthcare team with a video of the people that they're going to take care of them, that explain the procedure, having them keep the iPad during the hospital, and then have them keep the iPad even 90 days after hospitalization so that they continue to do FaceTime interviews with the health team and doing medication reconciliation, contributing data to a repository of registries for example, spine patients. And then just as an aside relative to that particular iPad story, so it turned out CMS told us we could not do that with Medicare and Medicaid patients. So this is one of the issues around innovation is sometimes you stumble upon certain regulatory things that get in the way, and this was because it was seen as patient inducement. By giving an iPad to a patient, even though they returned it, it was seen as something that was, so as you try to innovate, one of the things you run up against is a little bit of friction with the various different regulatory systems. Step 3 in this learning system that we've tried to design based on the think of a number of other people is leveraging what we're doing in IT. So taking the infrastructure of fully wireless everywhere and data networks, using the various different software tools that we have to extract data that we put into our data repository to analyze, to then innovate by creating these apps. And the key purpose of all of this is to functionally change behavior of the provider and to better understand the patient and to be able to then do things that are going to have clinical outcome measures that are better. And then the fourth step in this last of these 4 steps is how do we take what we've come up with and use market discipline and a proper business set of models to be able to externalize them beyond central Pennsylvania to other areas. So XG Health Solutions is a separate organization that our CEO actually just moved to, and we have a new CEO at Geisinger, but this is the arm that externalizes it, almost like a tech transfer type of organization. So I don't know if you know this guy, but he's very famous at Geisinger. So, and he happens to be an orthopedic surgeon, and he works here. And what's famous about him is the fact that his information is available about what patients think about him online. And we just thought this was incredible. And this is actually something from as recently as April. And if you read through the whole thing, but I like the first sentence. It says, this doctor came to the door and smiled at me and knew me and was sensitive to my needs and was well informed and had done a lot of surgeries. And this is the kind of, so in the learning health systems, one of the things that we ought to do is share our learning across different systems. So at our board meeting last week, we adopted exactly this process. And we are going live in a couple of months with this. So we're going to take all our applications, put them all online, take all of their comments and put them online and give them star ratings just because of what you guys have done here has been so successful. So thank you for that. So what are the drivers for the kind of reengineering that we have? And I'll go through these very quickly. We have unjustified variation in care and access and the cost of care and the quality of care. It's fragmented across a bunch of different caregivers. We have this addiction to perverse incentive in terms of how we get paid fee for service for different things. And then, we're up against these new payment models, which are going to change a little bit the dynamic of how EHRs are designed, because right now they're really designed to generate a clinical receipt rather than a clinical note. So ways to be able to cope with that change as it's coming. And we've noticed that they're too passive in their care process and how to engage them, how to make them more activated. We also know that 50% of the time patients don't get the care that they're supposed to get. So things that we all know we should be doing don't get done. And it's not because the physician doesn't know what they're doing or because the nurse doesn't care. It's because the hurly-burly of medicine and all the other things that distract us. And so how do we make that better? We also know that if we pay more for health care, we don't necessarily get better care. Actually, there's more of an inverse relationship. The more money I put into it, sometimes the worse care I get. There's not a correlation between the efficiency of the doctor and the effectiveness of the doctor and how much I pay for that work. And then there are other challenges that are up against us in terms of, has anybody heard the term meaningful use? So, stage 1 was good for digitalization. Stage 2 has tortured a number of people and sucked some of the innovation away from the EHR vendors that are trying to keep up with the certification criteria. And the adoption rate's not great for a program that's been out for a while, even though there's a bunch of money sitting at the end of the rainbow. So I think it's telling us something. You may have heard of a couple of breaches. They are occurring almost on a daily basis. The various different people that know a lot about this kind of topic are telling us that our systems have already been breached and that the people are residing inside our systems and waiting to be able to collect information when it's appropriate. The point being that the trick now is no longer to prevent somebody from coming into your system, but the idea is to be able to identify when somebody is in your system and stop them from doing nefarious things. So that's certainly something that's preventing us from being efficient. And then iatrogenesis, or the idea that we can cause harm with our systems, is another thing that we have to overcome. So you've got these lack of value that we're delivering and a whole series of different problems and challenges to overcome. So what are some of the touchstones that we have? And I'll go through this quickly and then get into what we're doing about changing this. So we want to engineer. One thing we, especially with a health plan and with our community providers, is we really want to engineer for the entire continuum of care. If we try to solve a problem at a point within an episode of a patient's life, we end up squeezing the balloon on one side and expanding it somewhere else. So when you're looking at the total care of the patient, the total cost of care of that patient, we're finding that we have to get into the retail clinics. We're finding we have to get into the grocery store. We're finding that we're going into the post-acute environment in terms of the special, the SNFs and the rehab areas, the hospice, and that the acute care hospital is just one small piece of the overall component. So to solve for the continuum of care requires different thinking, typically requires a lot of health plan assistance because they look at things from that perspective as opposed to the individual patients at the time. And with our health plan, kind of like what I was talking about, we have about 500,000 members and 50,000 providers, and population-based analysis and engaging the member and the employer. So even the lexicon is different as opposed to patients and physicians. And being able to have more of a market-driven approach is different than what we do on the care delivery side, where we're really trying to re-engineer systems of care delivery and continually improve and activate patients and families. But in between these two, for at Geisinger, about 36% of patients that receive their care at Geisinger also are members of our health plan. So we call that the sweet spot. And that's the spot where we can kind of test and innovate and try things out that would otherwise break us, so we can do things that will hurt the hospital in terms of revenue, but actually help the health plan in terms of revenue. And so we can kind of hedge backwards and forwards and understand where we can all benefit in terms of the overall continuum of care. So here is a sequence in, and I'll leave these slides for everybody to review, but just kind of over time you can see that we started with Epic in 1996. So we were the third client of Epic. So we kind of took the plunge, and somebody very smart thought about this back then. And then over time we did value reengineering. So you hear about these ProvenCare products, which is basically taking a process and understanding where the physician can share some of the work they need to do, and how to put a care manager, and how to make everybody accountable for what needs to be done for the patient all together as opposed to one person versus another. We did a medical home type of work. We call that Proven Health Navigator in 2007, and then continued on to other programs as we, again, negotiated with a sweet spot between the health plan and the clinical enterprise. And our approach to this was really to say, okay, if I have a patient in a condition and I'm just going to do in regular clear, how do I make that better? And the first step was doing population identification of the particular cohort that I'm trying to change, and then anything that is not digital, try to digitalize, and bundle that care in something that is understandable and can be made accountable to the provider population. And then once that's done, take that workflow modification from having re-engineered the process and redelegate work, use algorithms in being able to show work, automate things where they can be automated, and of course engage the patient in terms of their own of how to do that. So ProvenCare acute, ProvenCare chronic, those two different things. I'll talk briefly about diabetes, and these are not numbers that I'm necessarily proud of or that we're necessarily proud of. When we started this exercise, what we decided to do is take these measures such as pneumonia vaccination, microalbumin tests, and things like hemoglobin A1C at goal. So not process measures necessarily, but also patient outcome measures. And we said, we're only going to give ourselves credit when everything has been done. When things that you would fail your boards for if you didn't know you needed to do on the patient, not the big controversial things that everybody argues about, the things that we all know we should be doing. And we went after those. And we said, well, let's make sure those happen 100% of the time. And we started off at 2.4% of the time that those things actually occur, both in terms of patient outcome and in terms of process measures. And then over time, by re-engineering the process, incenting people the right way, and so forth, we got up to a fairly measly 18.5%. So, but that's not bad. I mean, it's a significant improvement, and you're doing things that are affecting, again, patient outcomes in terms of they have to move in the hemoglobin A1C, the LDL goal, the blood pressure goal, and so forth. But we think we're stuck at that stage because we still don't understand enough about the patient or the different types of patient to be able to do an intervention that's appropriate. So we think there's an asymptotal relationship that we've reached, and we better do something different in order to get better. Now, what we were able to show over 3 years of doing this is that we were saving the number of patients that had heart attacks, that had strokes, that had retinopathy, and we were doing so in a way that as you define value with your value officers by saying we're not going to just look at quality and illness saved, we're also going to look at cost. We want to do this in a way that reduces cost. So it's both reducing heart attacks and strokes and retinopathy while at the same time reducing cost overall, total cost of care. So we've done this ProvenCare exercise with a number of other things, both procedures and other illnesses, chronic and acute and so forth, and we ran into a problem. All that work, as great as it had been, was unshareable to anybody else without an enormous amount of effort. And then we went on to the next ProvenCare piece, which is the biologic work where we identify patients that have inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, anything that uses a biologic, and found that we could benefit from taking care of that better. We did a medical home work, and we got some good outcomes. And again, all this stuff is locked into our EMR. It's all in Epic. It's doing a good job in Epic, but I can't share it. And I can't take somebody else's better work and bring it into my system. So I make the case here that, if we're not careful, we're going to get leaped. So there's a bunch of other industries that have gotten leaped over time. And, healthcare, the way we deliver it is not all that different. So, there are business models that are emerging, like, telehealth services that are going across, state lines, and they're taking over some of the CVS Health, for example, that has come in strong with their minute clinics and so forth. So I think that we need to think about how we keep continuously improving as a byproduct of care what we're doing. And the government's helped us with a number of different reports. There's something called the PCAS report, the Jason report, the 10-year ONC vision, FIDESIA. All they're saying are similar type of things where payment incentives should be changed. We need to be using public standards that are non-proprietary to be able to exchange information. We need to be exchanging information and not information blocking, and so forth. You may have heard recently the Senate has been having these HELP committee meetings looking at EHRs. Tom Paine gave a great series of descriptions of what could be done. Number one on his list was simplification and making the speed faster of documentation, clearly being identified as one of the key pain points that I'm sure a lot of us would agree with. Now, it's been a slow week in Washington. There's not much going on. But this decision was pretty interesting, the King versus Burwell, for those of you who are following that, along with a number of sort of earth-shattering things in the Supreme Court last week. It all seemed like they come up at the same time. And now we have an embassy in Cuba, and Cuba's got an embassy in Washington. I mean, so I don't know. Things feel like they're changing plenty. So let's talk about EHR apps. So I stole this slide from the NIH as an example of how to design a really complicated system. And the point I wanted to make is back in the 1990s, this is how we built medical records systems. Best of breed systems that were tailored to a particular workflow, which was good. They were complex to architect and incredibly complex to maintain over time because there's one change, the other one didn't change, and there's a big ball and twine of interface messages. So the industry seemed to have responded to this is to create what is referred to as the monoliths. And so the monoliths are basically saying, rather than having this ball and twine of different interface messages, why don't we put everything on one database? It doesn't matter if it's a database from 1968, the months database. It doesn't matter if it's a relational system on Oracle that costs $1 million. Just so long we put it on one database, and then we'll do everything from there. Now, that solved the problem of upgrading the system as a whole, stabilizing the environment. But it did take away something that we had, which was a customization to the clinical workflow of the subspecialist, of other people, of the nurse, of the pharmacist, and so forth. And so what I would like to argue is the fact that this one database system has introduced some new problems. It also has made it, so you know about the story of the Tower of Babel. So these are all the architects sitting there, so Cerner, Epic, and then this is the tower, and of course they weren't sharing the same language and the same plans, and so they built this monstrosity, which can be thought of as maybe a health information exchange architecture. And the chances are that if we keep changing the name of health information exchange, it's not going to work. Like we called them CHINs in the 1990s, Community Health Information Networks. Then we called them RIOs. That didn't work. So then we called them health information exchanges. And it's still, you've got the same issues of governance, you've got the same issues of consent, you've got the same issues of lack of standards, and so forth. So what I'm arguing is maybe we should be using something like apps. Instead of just moving data around from system to system, we could move data and its functionality, its workflow around from system to system in an EHR agnostic way. And that's kind of what I want to get at. So I'm calling that, I made up the word, but it's called intra-appability instead of interoperability. And so we have a number of different applications that we build at Geisinger, and then we have our Epic system, a system of record that does its things well, like the ordering system and the documentation system, decision support, and so forth. These are the ones invented at Geisinger, could be invented anywhere, at University of Utah Healthcare, and these are the systems that are commercially available. And what we did is we took these different apps and rewrote them so they used something called smart platforms and FHIR resources. And I'll get into what that means. The idea was that we were able then to take our apps without changing the app and make it work in Cerner and make it work in Athena Health and do it in such a way that the clinician has no idea they're outside of Epic or Cerner or Athena. Do it in a way where it's actually embedded in the workflow where it's just a screen that you click a button and they see it. And I'll show you what that looks like. And the idea here, the key point was not to replace core functionality of the EMR per se, like the ordering system, but more to augment the capabilities where they're lacking or where the vendor is really not that interested in spending a lot of time because the number of rheumatologists around the country is relatively small. Each vendor has announced that they're going to have app stores specific to their particular vendor product. And each different app store has a different business model. So for example, Epic says, we'll give you, we'll make available an app store, but you have to be an Epic client. You can't be a vendor to get your app into our app store. Cerner has a different model, so anybody can write for it, and these are the various things that we want you to keep track of in terms of the curation process. So again, if I'm a developer, and if I'm trying to write apps into the HR, to be able to have to keep track of all those is going to be a challenge. So what we did is, I'll give you an example. So we created a rheumatology app, which I'll show you. We made sure that it worked. In other words, we submitted a patent, we got grants, we did national presentations, we talked about the actual outcomes that we had from that app. I show an example here of my colleague, Eric Newman, who did all this work with his team in terms of showing where there were material improvements over 22 months in terms of how patients were doing around a number of different bundle activities, and lower rheumatoid arthritis, in this case, disease activity of a cohort of just over 2,000 patients. He also was able to show that in similar to the other ProvenCare aspects, he was reducing cost in terms of de-escalation of biologics as a result of approximating the patient's symptoms as patient-generated data against the medications that were given in a way that was intuitive both to the patient and to the clinician. Now, the very important part of this story is, if you ask anybody, how long does it take to invent an entirely new process in that approved through Epic Corporate and then get it approved through your own IT department, it takes a long time. It has to go through a whole series of different steps to make sure that it's reliable, to make sure that it's secure, to make sure that there's an audit capability, to make sure that all those things are embedded in there. When we converted our rheumatology app from something threaded into Epic into something that was basically in a FHIR and a smart envelope, the entire process took 40 days from start to finish. And this was with a team that had never heard the term smart or FHIR before. So this wasn't something that took months or years to come up to speed with. From the moment we said go, which was, in this case, August 27th, to the moment it was completed as a proof of concept using some test patient data, was, as you can see, a very short period of time. These were not difficult skills for somebody to hone. They're skills that exist already everywhere for people who build websites, for people who know how to write things in RESTful API states, is a term that's used in terms of how the internet communicates with itself. So this is what the application looked like. And I'm allowed to show this screen because you're an Epic client. I have to do all kinds of shenanigans if you're not an Epic client because I can't show you Epic screens. They get very mad at me. So before Epic, before a FHIR, not before Epic, open up his Epic patient, and then would open up a separate screen that had the application on it. And what would happen is every day a certain amount of information about that patient will get downloaded based on the schedule. And on a per needed basis, the doctor could hit a button that said, okay, refresh the medications, and it would do a quick poll of the medications. And this was a way designed to make sure you didn't overload the systems and you didn't pull data from shadow production systems and so forth. Now, what we did instead, after we had done the Smart and FHIR project, is, as you can see here, we're no longer in Epic. We're in Cerner. And you can't really tell that you're outside of Cerner. And this is the exact same application that had been coded and designed with Smart, but it now is just clicking into the Cerner world. And what we were able to do as well is the way this part of the screen was working out of Columbia, Maryland. This part of the screen up here was working out of Kansas City, Missouri. And the information that was being shared between the two of them in terms of the authentication of that app into that patient's chart, the context of that patient in terms of who's the patient, who's the provider, what's the encounter, and the clinical data, the 11 elements of the medications, the allergies, and vital signs and other information were flowing in milliseconds, backwards and forwards in time without any more batch. So it's all real-time work. As this app opened and refreshed, it was refreshing all this information in real time. So just to kind of go through, and it's not that the app itself is earth-shattering in terms of its usability and its, its design. What was special about it is it was only put in front of the rheumatologist the kinds of things the rheumatologist wanted to see. So it was trying to simplify a little bit the view of, so it's things like, function, pain, review of systems, what's happened since the last video, pull in some of the information out of the EHR. And then it was doing something which was harder to do in Epic, which was being able to combine what the nurse was writing with what the physician was writing. So the two, it was basically a shared part of the chart together. And it was trending over time what was going on between here's the methotrexate and the titration of that medication that came from the EMR. Here is the symptoms as reported by the patient when they were in the clinic. The first thing when they arrive at the clinic is they enter what the symptomatology is. And that is basically trended over time. So you can see whether or not, again, the aha moment for the rheumatologist, here are the meds, here are the symptoms, are they working? Make it simple and easy for them to be able to keep track of that. And then make it simple and easy to use the various different ways of assessing whether rheumatoid arthritis is getting better over time to see if you're in the green zone or not in the green zone, in a way that is understandable to a patient. And then being able to keep track rather than in words, sometimes, it visually being able to show what are the joints in question, and then what is the global pain scale, and what are some of the other scales, and then how to import that information from previous visits to be able to keep track of it. So again, it's not that it was doing something dramatically different from an electronic health record perspective. We're not ordering things differently. We're not, doing things that the system of record can do, but we are re-rendering this information in a way that a clinician prefers with the patient engagement aspect. And then at the end, we just send to EHR, and the note goes back into the electronic health record. So all the information that was obtained and aggregated and defragged from the EHR ends up going back in. So we were able to create a data visualization layer. We had no prior knowledge of SMART or FHIR when we did this. Most of the FHIR resources utilized utilized with the rheumatology app as at the proof of concept completion, meaning that we had done all 11, because each FHIR resource really initially needs to be negotiated a little bit as you do it with a vendor for the first time, if they've never done it before. So for example, not to pick on any one vendor, we took a FHIR resource for medication, and we got problems from it. So we said that doesn't work. We want medications from that. So as you first do the thing and you're doing your test and you realize that there are just some initial bumps as the vendor themselves is trying to get used to this new way of looking at things, let's send you the wrong information through. So as we worked through that in a short period of time, and we were getting real data, and as a result of doing the recoding, we added some functionality we didn't have before in terms of being able to push problems back onto the problem list, which was important to be able to do. So in this exercise of building apps that work inside the EHR, even though they're actually functioning in another location, and they're pulling clinical data and pushing clinical data back into the electronic health record, we found that we needed to have a system engineer and approach being able to do this more at scale. So we used something called the incremental commitment spiral model, which is basically a way of saying, all right, if you have a clinician and they have a great idea and they start with a PowerPoint of their idea and a one-page document, how do you navigate that all the way into production? So how do you help them and give them a set of tools and a toolkit that says, okay, here's what you need to get to the point where you have proof of concept. And here's what the difference between proof of concept and prototype is in terms of you not using real patient data, or you are now in the clinical environment in a pilot form where you are using real patient data and real clinicians. And then what's the difference between a prototype and production, when if you're anything like us at Geisinger, we'll have these sort of perpetual pilots that go on for years. And so there needs to be some sort of threshold beyond which we say, we're going to call that production now, which means it does need all those things that regulatorily are needed for that. And I'm noticing the CIO smiling, so I'm wondering if that's something you run into before. So anyway, so this process we learned from. So what we learned is we had to negotiate a little bit more than expected in terms of the attributes exchange between the app and the EHR, but we got through that. There was a significant amount of code conversion on the vendor side as they were having to convert from their way of looking at the world to a non-proprietary way of looking at the world. And nonetheless, the code that we had to generate to make those kinds of exchanges was reusable across all the different EHRs. The other thing that emerged as we went through this exercise is we learned that there are probably going to be several different kinds of apps that need to be developed over time, or that will be developed over time. One of them will be just completely EHR agnostic. I'm the developer, I have no idea which EMR it's going to go into. I do this cool thing where I extract some information, I re-render something gorgeous, and then it goes back, in terms of a form or whatever. That would be a little bit how we did our rheumatology application. It's EHR agnostic. There's no interaction during the use of the tool between the EHR and the app. But then there are going to be others that potentially are more dependent. So maybe the EHR app comes with a series of order sets and templates and other things like that that are offered together. And then there'll be some that will be threaded through a particular EHR. So maybe Epic does something really well, and maybe Cerner doesn't do something very well. So I write an app that does something better in Cerner, but Epic doesn't really have a need for it, but it's threaded and dependent on the Cerner EHR itself. We went through a series of testing and validation processes. We used 11 out of the 49 FHIR HL7 resources that existed, and that turned out to be a large number compared to other people who were doing this exercise. We're using one or two. Now, Health Services Platform Consortium, you're probably most familiar with. There are other, and one of the key things there is, even though SMART does the authentication into the application, and even though SMART helps you get the context, and FHIR exchanges the clinical information, there's a whole series of other service-based things that will be necessary and useful to the developer who's writing these apps. And that has yet to manifest itself completely. And the people who are looking at service-based oriented architecture to these different services are those at the Health Services Platform Consortium as a good example. Project Argonaut was led by Anish Chopra and Miki Tripathi. So Anish Chopra was a CTO for Obama. His hair is on fire most of the time as he's running evangelizing different things. Miki Tripathi is a Massachusetts eHealth collaborative guy. The two of them came together and said, all right, let's bring a bunch of vendors together, and let's bring a bunch of health systems together and make sure that we advance the whole EHR apps within a period of 6 months and agree on what we're going to do. And then the next 6 months, we're going to advance it some more. So that's what Argonaut has dealt with. Commonweal is a way for different systems to agree on how they're going to share information. But there's still a number of different questions that remain unanswered. Where is my vendor-neutral app store for healthcare? It doesn't exist yet. What are the business models they're going to support when an app goes into an app store and then the company goes bankrupt or it's no longer supported? What happens then to the information, the patient information that's been flowing through that app? What happens when an app reduces the performance of an overall system and there are SLA, the service level agreements with your system and your vendor, and you're going to say, well, who's going to blame who about why the system was affected? So the point is, the App Store and the process of curating those apps and certifying those apps and making sure that they do what they're expected to do. Are they going to do something nefarious that actually collects data and does something that you don't expect? Is it going to do what it's expected to do? That process, that set of people or company, whatever, has not been created. Right now, it's a lot of innovators in this space and a lot of EHR developers that are trying to make it work, but the whole curation process, the whole certification process, and to be able to tell whether this is going to have a positive impact on the patient has yet to be established. So I wanted to come to a conclusion by saying the key point, which is this 100-day process we did with Cerner, which was 60 days of lawyers and 40 days of actual work, really didn't require a lot of people. In an IT world, when you look at these numbers in terms of 800 hours and $18,000, it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time, but that's kind of embryonic in terms of compared to other projects that are kind of on the IT. So it's a very small effort to have done something which makes your application work in a number of different systems. The amount of work it would have been required to recode that into another Epic client, or even more, recode that into Cerner or Athena would have been astronomically higher than this. So there's a leverage of scale you can get from that. So anyway, here's my information. This is the XG guys that are in the business of developing commercial products over that. And then I have a number of slides from some people you may recognize in terms of Neil Pattison and Carl Dvorak from Epic and Jonathan Bush that talk about how this was a good exercise and something we should be encouraging across the industry. So with that, I'll leave you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. But this is kind of our work in terms of taking knowledge that we've put into our learning health system, making sure that we can share it with others to improve what we're doing with patients. Thank you. Any questions?
Could you talk a little bit about where FHIR came from? Because I think people think it's a new thing. So could you talk
Yes.
about that a little?
So you may have heard of HL7, and HL7 is basically the way we exchange information between these clinical systems. In HL7, the most common version is 2 point something is what is being used, and as HL7 was trying to create the next evolution of this exchange between systems, they created something called version 3. It's called the Rheum model, and it was engineered by some super bright people and potentially over-engineered to the point where nobody could implement it. So a guy by the name of Graham Greaves in Australia decided to tackle this problem by doing something very intelligent that we sometimes could use more of in healthcare, which was dramatic simplification of the process. His premises were that he was going to try to write something that addressed 80% of a use case as opposed to 100, and that he was going to try to write something that used modern technology such as RESTful APIs, states, to be able to use this language so people who knew the common language of the web would be able to use it as well. So FHIR is the name that's used as the latest iteration of now a draft standard in its second testing phase of this exchange backwards and forwards. But it lacks a number of different things. Even though there are 49 FHIR resources that exist, these don't necessarily have profiles on top of them that describe exactly how the sender and the receiver are going to interact. So we ought to be careful as we proceed forward in making sure that we agree on how to make that exchange with all the profiles on top. Otherwise, we could run the risk of having everybody doing FHIR a different way. And Stan could probably speak to this more than I could because he's been a zealot about making sure that, that people understand that point. So the point is, it's not new. We've been doing HL7 for a long time. But in terms of how it's sort of navigated across the continuum and how we've arrived at this position, that part is pretty new. Yes?
This is an impressive summary of business process modulation of the context within which clinicians make decisions. You've changed the way information flows, the way it's presented, and it looks absolutely wonderful. You said briefly that some of the things were automated. My question is, have you automated anything that relieves the clinician decision maker from the need to make decisions because they're all overwhelmed? And if not, if you're not doing any closed loop work, are you doing any open loop work that goes beyond presenting information to the decision maker, but in fact presents instructions?
So a couple of ways I can answer that. So yes and yes. But the first one, yes, very carefully. When the system starts to make decisions for the clinician, there's all kinds of very nervous people that get involved. So having to do that with extremely high specificity is really important. So for example, the simplest thing is add in problems to the problem list for things which were very high specificity that should exist on the problem based on a lab, based on a number of other things that are not. So if a patient has hep C virus, RNA positive, and a number of other things, and it's not listed on the problem list, then we can automatically append the problem list with that issue. Sometimes, especially as we're learning, we'll pose it as a question: would you like me to add this to the problem list? Because it looks like it's something that we've found in the system. So that's one where we automate sometimes things, work we take completely away from the doc, for example, to do that. The open ones are a better example is the care gap process. So basically, we extract information out of the system every day. We're running against a whole series of different rules. that identify what are guidelines and what are things that can be automated. Now, obviously, not everything can be, but for those things that can be, when we identify that there's a gap and we're able to trend that over time, then we're able to push that back in the EMR in a passive way, where when somebody opens up the chart, without having to worry about any apps or anything else, and they go to a certain section of Epic, they show up there as unclosed. Would you like to go ahead and close those now? If they don't, because they're too busy, 73% of the time they don't get closed, which is a lot. But then 27% of the time they do, and they wouldn't never have been closed, or they would be less likely. There's a process whereby literally care managers remotely located, not at Geisinger proper, are calling patients and creating scheduled appointments and trying to bring patients back in when there's a need identified of something that's not getting closed over time. So there's automation automatically with lots of very careful work. There's automation from a put information in the view of the physician to make sure that it makes sense. So we've done a number of different things, but it typically requires getting information out. So far, it's required getting information out of Epic, processing it in a different type of data set, and then pushing it back in to do something in Epic.
So it sounds like you have not yet addressed time series management of problems like titration of heart failure with drugs or titration of rheumatoid arthritis. You showed the temporal change of rheumatoid arthritis expressions, but it was up to the clinician, from what I perceived, to make the decision. You didn't present the instruction that said it's time to increase methotrexate by this amount and then recheck this at this time.
That is correct. Now, where we've done closer to that, and I haven't shown this, is something called Supernote, is where we're taking information from the chart and generating a sentence that has bits and pieces in it that the billers are interested in and that the health plan is interested in. And we'll take the problem list, and the problem list is great, you add problems to, but people tend not to remove problems from, and your problem list just kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You may have asthma 10 times within the problem list, but different kinds of asthma. So this takes all those problems and arranges them in the way where all the asthmas are together, and it's pretty obvious that you've got duplication. And it will prompt to say, based on the PFTs, based on the number of visits to the emergency department, and based on the diagnosis of it, we think this is the right diagnosis of asthma intermittent or persistent, moderate, whatever it may be. Do you agree? If you click yes, then it takes the other asthmas out and puts that one in instead. That's closer to what you're talking about, but it still requires an intervention of the clinician to be able to do. Yeah?
Can you describe more about different institutions' data in the app that you showed, the rheumatoid arthritis app? So was it pulling data from two different systems into the one app? No.
It was pulling, in this case, it was an instance of, Cerner or an instance of Epic or an instance of Athena in one system. Now, if you had one system that was covering 22 hospitals, then presumably you could be doing the same thing. The patient happened to be hopping around the different hospital. But for the most part, it's one system to the app.
Okay, so you contrasted an HIE to Smart on FHIR apps.
Right.
What part of that overlaps?
So the part that overlaps, I think, is kind of the hypothesis I'm making that just moving data around is really not solving the problem, because we're in a position where it requires a lot of translation and semantic knowledge and data provenance to be able to understand how that works. So that's potentially part of the reason why health information exchange isn't working. Where the Smart on FHIR piece comes in is moving the actual clinical data around. The idea is to democratize the functionality across the different EHRs around instead. So I think you're picking up the fact perfect analogy, but it's the idea that there's a different way to approach learning from the information, particularly sharing workflow. Makes sense? Yes?
You spoke earlier about hitting that impact wall, and your
Yes.
diabetes data shows that.
Yeah.
Part of that problem is patient and physician adoption, and other big part of that is sustainable use once they do adopt it. Both of those are big issues, and we hate to see Big Brother like CMS come in and say this is going to be one of our new quality metrics that you have to do. We're going to study you on this. So what has Geisinger done to try and overcome that problem, and has it been successful?
So far, and I could pull the data back up, but so far over years it remains, it doesn't come, we don't lose. And I showed one of several different types of scenarios where one's with cabbage and being able to meet all 46 different kinds of measures on cabbage and how successful that is. So from a hitting the asymptotal relationship of that and not losing it, it gets embedded when you've made it electronic and you've automated it, it becomes part of what you do every day, so you tend not to lose. What we're running into in terms of how do we get better is we've gone into a whole other world of behavioral analytics on the provider and on the patient. And subsegmentation, so we have, it's almost like a homeopathic view of the world, but we have, certain kinds of providers, ones that do this versus ones that do that. What's the best intervention to the provider? Certain kinds of patients, ones that will always do what you say, ones that will never do what you say, and then everything in between, and what's the best way to intervene with them. So I think we believe that will start to dial back up that compliance piece. But I think in terms of how will CMS say this is the value that we're going to measure you by, we're not going to do fee-for-service anymore, we're going to do value-based, and here's the outcome that we expect you to get. I think we're all extremely nervous about what that's going to be picked at based on the history of how that has been measured in the past. Yeah.
Is the app limited to the data fields that Epic or Cerner provide? So are you creating any additional functionality and requiring any storage of data that wasn't required by the Cerner application or the Epic application?
So it's absolutely not restricted to the constraint of the system of record. As a matter of fact, probably the model that will emerge to make the most amount of sense is one where you're taking some clinical information out of the EHR, but you then finding a bunch of data points from other things. It could be a social network stream of data that comes in. That could end up interacting with a cloud-based, HIPAA-compliant, place where you're doing calculations, algorithms, and so forth, and then having that combination of data work its way into your visualization and then push back into EHR. So I think the app likely with time will graduate from being constrained by EHR data and start to move into a number of different non-EHR data domains that will interact with something outside of the EHR. Now, the problem we'll run into with that is then your security officer and privacy officer is going to start saying, where is that PHI going? And can I make sure that that PHI is protected? And that as an app developer and selling that software or providing that software, am I signing a business associate agreement? And do I have the right controls of encryption at rest, encryption in motion, and BAA and other security? Because if you're going to have patient data outside of your system of record, what's happening to that? Do I know? Is it safe? Am I comfortable that you're not going to be a fly-by-night app developer with my patient data and then all of a sudden get it loose? Yeah.
Do you have an example of new knowledge that has been forthcoming from your learning healthcare system, or is that still in the future?
So I'm trying to think through. So the new knowledge, as an example, is I work on, and there are a lot of answers to this, and there's a lot of other people that will provide better answers, but I'll do my best. What we're doing around reengineering and keeping track of where people are. So as a byproduct of care, you walk into the room, you walk out, you go into the nurse's station, you get a med, you come back in. The new knowledge is the amount of time you're spending with a patient in an automated way. So I introduce a new workflow into the clinical environment. How is that really impacting the time I'm spending with a patient, the lengths of stay, the total cost, so forth? So what we do is we set up in our learning environment around reengineering 2 units that constantly are measuring 250 different measures, process and outcome measures, and 2 units that are intervention groups that are doing the same thing. And we'll do an intervention only to 2. And we'll measure, so a new workflow, a new process, a new algorithm, and then we're able to see, so those are 2 controls, obviously, and then and they all baseline measured controls. So the clinicians and nurses have no idea that this is going on, that this is being measured. So as a byproduct of them walking around, these are constantly being collected, and we can see if there's an impact on length of stay on that unit, or mortality, or if there's an impact on the amount of time the nurse now is away from the patient because they have to do more things at the computer and that kind of thing. That's kind of an example, not a great one, of the sort of way that as a byproduct we're getting through some of that. Yes?
Just one other question. Is the vision of Geisinger to produce these solely for Geisinger and to produce more of them, or is it to produce one, make it really great, and then to begin offering it? Because I can see a problem with offering it to more and more and more clients. You're ultimately going to become responsible for servicing and responding to questions and technical feedback.
So, yeah, it's a good, so of the 4 steps that we go through, the ideation aspect, the application research aspect, the production, and the last one, which was the commercialization. That commercialization is not Geisinger. It's a separate company that has product managers and salespeople and all those kinds of folks that are responsible for taking that product and making it, creating the business plan and finding the right market and selling it to that group. So not everything ends up making its way to XG Health Solutions. The ones that there's a market for go there, and then they have the right market discipline to be able to actually support the product and write contracts that say that they support the product. But I think Geisinger, when it tried to do that by itself, struggled because you're running around taking care of patients, operation, other things, and it didn't have product managers and salespeople, in the system.
The app you built, was that against the production system, or was that kind of proof of concept?
Proof of concept. Well, actually, let me qualify, sorry. For 3 years, it was in the production system. Rheumatologists only use this. But the Smart FHIR version of it was a proof of concept because the vendor doesn't support FHIR in production yet. Yeah, and so we can cheat and do FHIR coming out of the app and then their proprietary system until they actually can support it. Yeah.